She refused to touch any man until the rancher collapsed into her arms. Mira had lived on this barren planet for 5 long years. A remote outpost on the fringes of the galaxy, the dusty town was home to few, and she liked it that way. Her life was simple, her days spent tending to the small ranch she had built from scratch. The winds howled across the endless deserts, the land cracked under the heat, and the sky was a pale blue, always unforgiving. But Mira had learned to survive, to endure. She wasn't alone. There were the other settlers, of course, but Mira kept her distance. Her heart had been broken once, many years ago, and she had sworn never to let a man get close again. Relationships were messy, filled with lies, betrayals, and broken promises. She had no interest in repeating that pain. Instead, she focused on her ranch, her animals, and the land that seemed to constantly fight against her. On a warm afternoon, as Mira was repairing a broken fence near the southern edge of her property, a figure appeared on the horizon. At first she thought it was just another mirage, a trick of the heat rising from the cracked earth. But as the figure drew closer, Mira squinted, realizing it was a man, a stranger. His steps were slow, dragging, as though he had been walking for a long time. His clothing was ragged, and his face was covered in dust and sweat. He staggered under the weight of whatever supplies he carried in his pack, his posture bent with exhaustion. Mira's heart skipped a beat, but not for the reasons it once did. No, she wasn't interested in him. He was just another wanderer, passing through, no different from the others who had come and gone over the years. She tried to ignore the uneasy feeling in her stomach, telling herself it was nothing. But something about him felt different. There was a vulnerability in his movements, a quiet strength that drew her attention. The stranger was now within shouting distance, and Mira prepared to call out a warning. But before she could, the man collapsed to the ground with a loud thud. His pack fell beside him, and he lay motionless in the dust. Her instinct kicked in, and Mira quickly rushed toward him, her boots kicking up dirt as she moved. As she knelt beside him, she could see the faint rise and fall of his chest. He was still alive, barely. His face was pale, his lips cracked, and his skin was burned from the harsh sun. She didn't know what had brought him here, but he was clearly in no condition to be left alone. Mira hesitated. She didn't want to help him. She had made it this far without depending on anyone, and she wasn't about to start now. But the man's breathing was shallow, and he looked like he was on the brink of death. Against her better judgment, she grabbed his shoulder, gently shaking him. "Hey," she muttered, trying to rouse him. "Are you okay?" His eyes fluttered open, and for a moment he seemed confused, disoriented. Then his gaze fixed on her, and something shifted in his eyes. There was recognition, and for a brief second she thought she saw relief. But it was gone in an instant. I'm not sure," he murmured, his voice raspy, barely audible. "I need water." Mira's heart softened, just for a moment. She couldn't leave him here to die. She'd seen too many people lost to the desert, and she wasn't about to let another soul fall victim to it. She carefully helped him sit up, supporting his weight as she reached into her pouch for a water flask. The cool water was a welcome relief to him, and he drank eagerly, taking slow, careful sips. "Thank you," he whispered once he'd finished, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. Mira nodded, keeping her distance. She didn't want to feel anything. She couldn't afford to. "I'm not doing this for you," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "I don't owe you anything." The man gave a small, understanding smile, though it was weak. "I understand," he said softly. Then his head drooped as he passed out again, his body too weak to stay conscious any longer. Mira sighed, her gaze sweeping over the empty land around them. The silence was deafening, the kind of silence that only the desert could provide. It was almost peaceful in its stillness, and yet Mira felt restless. She glanced back at the man, feeling a pull she didn't understand. He was a stranger. He was just another person passing through. He would leave, and she would go back to her life. She had no need for men, especially not a broken, dying one. But something about him felt familiar, in a way. She shook the thought away, trying to focus on the task at hand. Taking a deep breath, she stood up, dusting off her hands. She had to get him inside and tend to his injuries. Whether she liked it or not, he was her responsibility now, for better or worse. The days passed slowly after the stranger arrived at Mira's ranch. Each morning she would tend to the animals and repair fences, doing the work she had grown used to, and each evening she would return to her cabin, only to find the stranger, still weak from his ordeal, sitting by the fire she had made for him. His name, he had told her, was Eli. But beyond that, there was little else she knew about him. He never spoke much about his past, and Mira was fine with that. She didn't want to know. She had her own life to focus on, her own memories to keep buried. Still, as the days went by, she found herself drawn to him in ways she couldn't explain. His calm demeanor, his quiet strength. It was almost like he didn't belong here, in the harsh, lonely land where she had carved out her existence. And yet, there he was. Despite her best efforts to keep her distance, Mira found herself caring for him. Each time he struggled to get up or seemed too weak to do simple tasks, she couldn't help but step in. She didn't want to. She didn't need to. But something inside her urged her to help, to offer him the comfort she had denied herself for years. It was a strange feeling, one that made her feel exposed. She didn't like it, not one bit. Eli, for his part, was grateful but never asked for more than she was willing to give. His eyes would follow her every time she entered the room, as though he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Mira could see the curiosity in his gaze, but there was something else, something she couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was respect, or maybe it was something deeper, a connection she feared acknowledging. "I'm fine, you know," Eli said one evening as Mira helped him sit up. "I'm not one to sit idle for too long." Mira glanced at him, surprised by his attempt to stand on his own. "You're still recovering," she said curtly. "Don't push yourself." He smiled weakly, his face still pale. "I don't like being a burden." "You're not a burden," Mira replied, though her tone was guarded. "Just take it easy for a while. I'll finish up the work for now." He gave a nod of understanding, though Mira could see the frustration in his eyes. She couldn't deny that he was a fighter, someone who was used to doing things for himself. But out here, in this unforgiving world, survival often meant relying on others. And despite her hesitation, Mira knew that helping him wasn't just about doing the right thing. It was about something she couldn't quite explain. Over the next few days, Mira noticed small changes. Eli was no longer just a man lying in her cabin, weak and helpless. He helped when he could, whether it was fixing the fence or tending to the animals. It wasn't much, but it was something. Mira, too, began to see him differently, not just as a stranger she had reluctantly taken in, but as someone who had something to offer. He didn't talk much about his past, but his actions spoke louder than words ever could. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the ranch, Mira found herself sitting beside him. They hadn't spoken much since their initial conversation, but now, as they watched the last rays of sunlight slip away, it felt like the right time to break the silence. "Where are you from?" Mira asked, her voice quieter than usual. She hadn't meant to ask, but it came out anyway, a curiosity she couldn't suppress. Eli looked at her, his gaze steady. "A small town not far from here," he replied. "It's not much, just a place to survive, like most places in this part of the galaxy." Mira nodded, though she wasn't sure what she expected to hear. "And why were you out in the desert?" Eli sighed, his eyes distant. "I was heading to a colony trying to deliver supplies, but the sandstorm caught me off guard. I've been out there too long without water." He paused, looking at her with a trace of gratitude. "I guess I was lucky to stumble upon you." Mira didn't respond right away. She was still unsure how to feel about the man beside her. Her instincts told her to be cautious, to keep her distance, but her heart, something she hadn't paid attention to in years, whispered otherwise. She didn't trust it. She couldn't. "I'm not looking for company," she said, her voice firm, though it trembled slightly. "I keep to myself for a reason." "I don't need anyone getting in the way of that." Eli didn't push her. He simply nodded and fell quiet. The fire crackled between them, its warmth mingling with the cool evening air. Mira was grateful for the silence, the lack of pressure, but in that stillness something shifted. It was subtle, but it was there. A connection, an understanding that hadn't been there before. And it scared her. The heat of the day was still lingering when Mira and Eli finished the last of the repairs to the fence. The ranch was finally starting to look like it had a chance at surviving the harsh desert landscape that stretched out endlessly before them. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. The land had tested her, but she had always found a way to make it work. Now, though, it felt different. The air was thick with an unspoken tension between them, something Mira had never allowed herself to feel before. Eli's presence had become a constant part of her daily routine. She couldn't deny it any longer. He had become someone she could rely on, someone who was there when she needed him. But that didn't mean she was ready to face the emotions that came with it. "Thanks for the help," she said, wiping her hands on her worn jeans. "I would have never gotten through all that on my own." Eli looked at her, his face warm with the satisfaction of a job well done. "You could have done it without me." I'm just glad I could pull my weight around here." Mira nodded, but the words felt hollow. She didn't want to admit it, but she knew the truth. She needed him. She didn't want to, but she did. The thought sat in her chest like a weight, making it hard to breathe. The wind kicked up as dusk approached, and Mira turned toward the cabin, ready to call it a day. But as she stepped forward, she saw Eli swaying on his feet, his expression suddenly pale. Before she could react, he collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud. Her heart raced. She ran to him, panic flooding her chest. "Ellie! Eli, wake up!" She knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she tried to lift his head. He was unconscious, his skin clammy with sweat, his breathing shallow and labored. She could feel his pulse, weak but steady. Mira's mind raced. What was happening to him? He had been fine just moments ago. But now his body betrayed him, and she was faced with the helplessness she had spent so many years avoiding. She had been alone for so long, had learned to take care of herself, never relying on anyone. But now, Eli was the one who needed help, and it was up to her. Without thinking, she scooped him into her arms, lifting him carefully, as if his weight was nothing. He was heavier than he looked, but she was determined to get him inside. The walk to the cabin seemed endless, each step taking more out of her than the last, but she refused to stop. Once inside, Mira laid Eli down on the bed, her hands trembling as she checked his vitals. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his breathing grew more ragged with each passing moment. He needed water, food, something. She wasn't sure what was wrong, but she had to act fast. Mira hurried to the small cabinet where she kept her medical supplies. She rummaged through the shelves, trying to remember everything she had learned over the years. First aid, herbal remedies, anything that could help him. She finally found what she needed: a healing salve to cool his fever, a vial of electrolyte solution, and some bandages. She quickly got to work, applying the salve to his skin and dabbing at his forehead with a damp cloth. She knew she was doing all she could, but it felt like it wasn't enough. He was still too pale, too still. Minutes felt like hours. Her heart was in her throat, and she couldn't stop herself from checking his pulse again and again, hoping for a sign that he would wake up, that he would be okay. And then, finally, Eli's eyelids fluttered open. He groaned softly, his voice barely a whisper. "Mira." She was by his side in an instant, her heart pounding in her chest. "Eli, you're awake." "You're going to be okay." He blinked a few times, his eyes focusing on her with effort. "What happened?" "You collapsed. You've got a fever." "You're dehydrated," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You need to rest." Eli's brow furrowed as he tried to sit up, but Mira gently pushed him back down. "Stay still. You're not going anywhere until you're better." He smiled faintly, though his expression was weary. "I don't..." Mira raised an eyebrow. "I don't think you have much of a choice." Eli chuckled softly, the sound weak but real. "Guess not." She stood up, stepping away from the bed, but not far enough to leave him. "You should sleep. I'll keep an eye on you." Eli's eyes closed again, but his hand reached out weakly, grabbing hers. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt through Mira. She froze, unsure of what to do, unsure of what the sudden rush of emotions meant. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Mira's heart tightened. She didn't know what to say. "You didn't cause any trouble," she said, her voice softer than she meant it to be. "Just rest. You'll be fine." But the truth was, Mira didn't know if he would be fine. She didn't know if she could handle the weight of someone else depending on her. It was easier when it was just her and the land, no one to rely on, no one to worry about. She could handle that. But Eli, he was different. There was something about him, something that made her want to care, made her want to protect him. It was the kind of feeling that scared her more than anything. The days following Eli's collapse passed more quietly than Mira had expected. He remained in her care, though his condition improved steadily, and Mira found herself growing accustomed to his presence. He still couldn't do much work, but he insisted on helping when he could, whether it was fixing small things around the cabin or checking on the animals. He seemed to push himself, not wanting to feel like a burden. Mira didn't mind. The work on the ranch was hard, and having Eli there to help made things easier, even if it was in small ways. Yet, as much as she told herself she didn't need him, as much as she convinced herself she could manage alone, there was a growing realization deep within her. She was starting to care. The realization startled her at first. She had been alone for so long that she had forgotten what it was like to share space with someone else, to have another person depend on her. But it wasn't just that. There was something about Eli, his quiet strength, his kindness, his willingness to help without question, that made her feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Hope. Hope for something more than the lonely existence she had created for herself. It scared her. She had always been afraid of needing someone, afraid of the vulnerability that came with it. But now, she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him. One afternoon, as Mira and Eli were working together to repair the barn, a group of settlers from the nearby town arrived. They had heard about the recent sandstorm and came to check on the ranchers in the area. It was a small group, but their presence was enough to remind Mira of the world beyond her ranch, a world that she had kept at arm's length for so long. She stood with her arms crossed, watching as Eli interacted with the settlers. He spoke with ease, his voice calm and steady, while Mira kept her distance, not fully engaging. She wasn't sure why, but she felt uncomfortable. Maybe it was the reminder of how isolated she had become, or maybe it was because, for the first time in years, she felt like she was no longer alone in the world. As the settlers prepared to leave, one of them, a woman named Clara, approached Mira. Clara was younger than Mira, with a bright smile and a curiosity about everything. She had always been friendly, and Mira could tell she meant no harm, but there was something in her eyes that made Mira feel exposed. "How's Eli doing?" Clara asked, glancing toward the barn where Eli was helping the others load supplies.
Mira hesitated.
"He's recovering." "He's doing fine," Clara nodded. "It's good to see him up and about. He's a good man, you know." Mira's heart skipped. She hadn't expected Clara to say that. She hadn't thought anyone had noticed the bond between her and Eli, but apparently they had. "He's just helping out," Mira said, her voice clipped. Clara didn't seem to notice the tension in Mira's voice. "I can see that." "But Mira," she said softly, "sometimes you don't have to do everything alone." Mira stiffened at the words. Clara's kindness, her warmth, made Mira feel exposed in a way she wasn't ready for. "I'm fine," Mira said quickly, turning away. "I've got it covered." Clara didn't push. She simply nodded and said, "Take care of yourself, okay? And remember, you don't have to shut everyone out." Mira watched as Clara left with the rest of the group, the words hanging in the air long after they had gone. She knew Clara was right, but admitting it was harder than anything she had ever done. She didn't know how to let someone in, not again. Not after everything she had been through. That evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the desert in shades of gold and pink, Mira sat outside, her back against the old cabin. Eli was inside, resting after another long day of work, but Mira couldn't shake the thoughts swirling in her mind. She had spent so long telling herself that she didn't need anyone, that she was better off alone. But now, with Eli in her life, it felt like everything had changed. She wasn't sure if it was for the better, but it felt different. It felt right. She thought of Clara's words, and the realization hit her all at once. She had been shutting herself off from the world, keeping herself isolated from the very people who could offer support. She had built walls around her heart, convinced that if she didn't let anyone in, she would never have to face the hurt again. But now, those walls were starting to crumble, and Mira didn't know if she was ready for it. But maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to be ready. Maybe she could let herself care, let herself be part of something more than just survival. As the night settled in, Mira stood up and walked inside. Eli was sitting by the fire, his eyes tired but content. He looked up as she entered, his gaze warm and steady. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Mira nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was lying to him or to herself. "I'm fine," she said, her voice quieter than usual. Eli didn't push. Instead, he simply smiled and patted the seat next to him. "Come sit with me." For a moment, Mira hesitated, but then she walked over and sat down beside him. The warmth from the fire felt comforting, but it was the presence of Eli beside her that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. "You know," Eli said softly, "I'm glad I found you." Mira glanced at him, surprised by his words. "You've found me?" He chuckled softly. "Well, you're hard to miss when you're out here, taking care of everything." She smiled faintly, but there was something in his tone that made her heart flutter. She didn't know if it was the warmth of the fire or if it was something more, but she knew one thing for sure. Things were different. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel afraid.